Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I'll tell you, we're in a really tough time with this society as far as critical theory goes. I think there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think people are starting to wake up and realize some of the real negative effects of this view. So I wanted to go back to a book that I think is maybe the best single book dealing with this. It's by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. It's called Critical Dilemma, and it's called subtitled The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideology, Implications for the Church and Society. And what I like a lot about this book is it's in depth. It discusses the other side and gives them fair hearing. And it's not a rant. It's not extreme. It's not emotional, but it's clear and it's really well done. Now, I've done one podcast in the past in which I got about maybe halfway through a chapter that's called Problems with Contemporary Critical Theory. And of course, that's the heart of the whole book. So I took my time on that. I only got about 10 or 15 pages of the chapter. And I'm going to continue that with this podcast. And I don't know if we'll finish the chapter. We may do one more on that. But just to give you a background so you know what we're talking about here, the authors, one more time, Shenvi and Sawyer, say that there are really four central ideas of critical theory these days. One is what they call a social binary, right? Look at that word binary. So the people who push critical theory say our society is divided into the dominant, the privileged group, the oppressor group, whatever you want to call them, and the subordinate or the marginalized or the oppressed group. Okay, so you got just two. The ones who are on top and the ones who are on the bottom. And they are divided according to race and class and gender and sexuality and physical ability, immigration status, religion, and so on. And that's that idea of intersectionality, that somebody, for example, might be a black, lesbian woman, right? So there are three areas of that person being in a subordinate or marginalized role. Now, what if you're a black, gay man? Well, you've got two of the three that put you in a oppressed group, but you got the male being in the dominant group. So anyway, they call that intersectionality. So that's number one. They call that the social binary, splitting society in half. Number two is what they call hegemonic power, that it's not so much overt acts of injustice, grabbing people and throwing them in jail just because of their skin color, but it's the way in which the dominant group, fill in the blank, could be males, it'd be Christians, it'd be white people, how they impose their values and their traditions and their norms and their ways of doing things. They push that on society, and until all of society thinks, oh, that's natural, oh, that's normal, oh, that's God ordained. And so that's structural. They said it's all over throughout the system. So that's called hegemonic power. Number three, lived experience. And what they're saying there is that for people who are in minorities and in the oppressed group, their lived experience actually is prioritized over objective evidence and reason when it comes to understanding how the world works. So when people say things like, believe the women, right? If there's a clash in some area of which men and women are coming on different sides of the issue, their idea is women have lived as oppressed, and you've got to take their word, take their view as prioritized or more important than objective evidence. Okay, so the idea is that you get special knowledge if you're in the minority. All right, number four, social justice. Now, what are they talking about there? That these people who are pushing critical theory say we need to transform society. Now, how do we do that? Freedom. We empower, we emancipate these marginalized and disenfranchised groups. So we have to pull apart the system that's here today. We have to pull apart the structure, that hegemonic power norm that created and perpetuates this social binary. So that it undergirds, I would say, all modern critical social theories. All right, so one more time, real quickly, because this is important. We have to know, what do they believe before we can look at them and scratch our heads and say, wait a minute, what are the problems here? So number one, the social binary. Number two, the idea of hegemonic power. Number three, the idea of lived experience. And number 4 is social justice. So that is part of what the whole critical theory is about. That's the heart and soul of it. So I think what I'll do is I'll look back. I might skip the part that we talked about at first. Oh, this book on page 282 has a really wonderful table. It's worldview questions answered by Christianity versus contemporary critical theory. Oh, this is so good. I did this in the previous podcast, but that was a long time ago. I really would like to cover this again. So it's got 3 headings at the top. What's the question? How does Christianity answer it? How do contemporary critical theorists answer it? So here we go. Question 1. Who am I? Christianity says a creature made in God's image. What is contemporary critical theory? You're a member of a social group that's locked in a struggle for dominance. Okay, second question. What's our fundamental human problem? Sin. That's the Christian view. Oppression. That's the critical theory view. Now, how do we solve that problem? Christian view. Redemption through Jesus. Critical theory. Activism. Solidarity. What's my primary moral duty? Christianity says glorify God. The critical theory. Tear apart these unjust systems and structures. How do I know truth? Question. Christianity's answer, revelation and reason. Critical theory, lived experience. What's the end goal of history? Where are we going? Christianity, a new heaven and new earth. Critical theory, social justice. Okay, so I think that's really powerful. Okay, so let me move along here. We've talked about some of these issues before. Hegemonic power. Okay, they talk about that, but we've covered that. So you can go back and take a look if you want. Let me take it to page 292, because here's where they get into the third of those 4 points. So they've already covered the social binary and the idea of hegemonic power, and now the third one is lived experience, right? So they really prioritize the idea of lived experience, okay? So because of these beliefs, it says it's really hard if you're a privileged person to try to challenge the claims of a person that comes from a marginalized group. So if a man says, they give an example, if a man says, well, we have a gender pay gap. Okay, I believe that. But it's largely a function of woman's personal choice. But a woman can counter with her lived experience that she had sexual harassment at work. And his appeal to evidence can be just tossed. He's a male. He has power. He has privilege. So how do you get a discussion going? And then they said, what about another issue? A white person says, well, if you look at the statistics, killings of unarmed black men, and that's awful, but it's rare. But somebody else can say, who's in a minority group, say, well, you're blinded by your white privilege. So you've got to defer to the lived experience of people of color. So there goes objective evidence tossed out the window. And we see that all the time. They give an example in the book here, a little lengthier example I think is so good. It says there's an activist, Lisa Sharon Harper, sorry, that's her last name, Harper, and she was interacting with Tim Keller, the Christian pastor. So Keller had written in 2018 an op-ed for the New York Times, and that he said historical Christian positions on social issues don't match up with political alignments. Well, here's her response. How, and this is capitalized, how incredulously privileged for Keller, caps again, a rich white man whose ministry targets rich people, to fashion himself as a judge of whether or not injustice rises to the level of oppression. No, the only ones with divine authority to define the bounds of oppression are the oppressed themselves. Oppressed and colonized people wrote every single word of the Bible. The Jewish people were colonized. Jesus was a brown, indigenous, colonized man. Not one person who the scripture is written by or originally written for sat in the social location of Tim Keller. And on and on. Keller has no authority to speak or teach on justice. Okay, so you can see she is just simply dismissing him. So power dynamics determines who gets to speak. Do you see that? And who has to listen and who has to agree, who has to sit there and just nod their heads. Privileged people, whether they're white or whether they're men or they're rich, they have to defer to the lived experience of the oppressed. They are always right, the white and the rich and the men are always wrong. And said, well, doesn't that run into a problem? What about two people of color or two women if they conflict? No group is monolithic. Then there are women who believe the gender pay gap is the result of personal choices. So what do you do here? But they said the notion of internalized oppression comes into play. So the critical theory people will say that all people are socialized and they absorb, in other words, they're being brainwashed into social reality. So if a woman rejects the idea that patriarchy is an oppressive force in women's lives, in other words, men running everything, if a woman says, no, that's not really what's going on, that person gets dismissed. You have an internalized misogyny, right? You hate men. You've absorbed that. You hate women. You've absorbed that from the culture. So a black man who rejects the idea of white supremacy is all through our society. If he says, no, that's not true, he's going to be dismissed. You have internalized. You've been brainwashed into accepting racism. So the upshot is that nobody can contradict this narrative that's given by the critical theorist. If you offer any resistance or if you offer any criticism, that it invalidates those people's experience that are marginalized. So it's a put down. They said, despite that, some Christians really are hesitant to reject this emphasis on lived experience. I mean, the Bible itself says we're supposed to be quick to hear and slow to speak. That's in James. Now we're supposed to recognize our own capacity to be hypocrites and to be blind. That's in Matthew 7. So maybe we should listen to experiences that challenge our own and our own hidden assumptions. And the two authors said, yes, sure. We should be quick to hear, slow to speak, and we're supposed to test everything. But the problem with the idea that lived experience shouldn't be challenged, it takes the place of Scripture and Scripture-informed reason as the final arbiter of truth. Do you see how it throws that out completely? So lived experience, whatever somebody says who's a marginalized person, whatever that person says, you've got to accept it. But are we supposed to take what is said and line it up with Scripture and Scripture-informed reason? So here are some examples, they said, of appeals to lived experience. As a woman, I know that society is systematically sexist. Oh, so you can't argue with that because that's a woman. How about this? As a person of color, I know that society is systemically racist. Okay, so you're not allowed to argue with that because the person of color, that's lived experience, said it. Here's a third one. As a lesbian, I know that homosexuality is good and right. Again, what do you say if you're a Christian? How about this one? As an atheist, I know there is no God. As a transgender woman, I know that I was born in the wrong body. As a Sufi Muslim, I know that Islam is true. As a Hindu, I know that all paths lead to God. Now it says if we're committed to the proposition that we should never challenge these people, we're going to have to accept all of that. But that contrasts with Scripture. Scripture says we are to test all claims against God's revelation in the Bible. We're supposed to weigh them by appealing to reason and evidence. And they give a bunch of verses, and I think that's important for me to stop here at this point and give you those verses so that you can see that the Bible does insist that we test anything people say against God's revelation in the Bible and weigh them by appealing to reason and evidence. God made us in His image. We are people who can reason. So here they are. Deuteronomy 18:22, Proverbs 18:17, Isaiah 8:19 through 20, John 10:38, Acts 1, verse 3, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, 1 John 4, 1 through 3. Okay, the authors then go on to say that the people who push this idea of lived experience, they dismiss anybody who appeals to evidence or even to Scripture. Western science is going to be seen as a white supremacist, capitalist, colonialist enterprise that uses people in lab coats to underwrite their truth claims. And what does that do? It advances the power of rich white men. according to Scripture, appeals to Scripture, you say according to Scripture, they write that off. They said that's just appealing to the white Western masculine interpretation of Scripture. What about an appeal to a creed or a confession? That's Eurocentric theology. That's slaveholder theology. That's colonizer theology. So that you can't get a discussion going. It said sometimes we see that in post-evangelical scholars. They're committed to deconstructing evangelical projects. All right, let's go ahead here. Here's a good point. They said if sola scriptura, right, that's coming out of the Reformation, if sola scriptura is replaced by sola lived experience, we'll be left with what Judges said. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That'll be our 21st century American version of that, right? Whatever people say, just go along with it. They said, here's a problem too. Institutions that have embraced critical theory, this idea of lived experience, are going to have to weaken or abandon their commitment to free expression and to evidence-based debate. Yes, that's exactly right. Where is there room for debate? There's none. Once a person who's in one of these marginalized groups, one of these oppressed peoples, once they speak, you're done. You can't offer any reason, you can't offer any argument at that point. Why? Claims were going to be dismissed as a power play. You're just trying to maintain the status quo. So you don't even ask if these things are objectively true. Speech deemed harmful to certain marginalized groups are going to be discouraged, right? You can't say that. It's going to hurt somebody. So what happens for any institution that's trying to commit to knowledge and truth-seeking? I'll tell you what I think of immediately are college campuses. We're starting to see that. If you say something that might be offensive to somebody, you can't say it. You're not supposed to say it. All right, let's see. Let me go ahead here. Here's another problem. They said, critical theory assumes that this existence of privilege indicates injustice or oppression. They said that's not true. In every society, there will be majority populations that will define what's expected, but it doesn't follow that that's automatically systemic or systemic, yeah, I got it right, systemically unjust. It said, for example, let's say you got a food market in Indonesia, and what does it do? It's going to fill it full of Indonesian food, and it's going to take American food and maybe put it in a small ethnic section somewhere in the back of the store. Well, if you're a visiting American, is that oppression? Is that injustice? I don't think so, right? So that's not a problem. They said there are God-ordained norms that are not social constructs, right? For example, the marriage as a union between one man and one woman, that does privilege a male and a female, heterosexuals, but it's not oppressive. It's good. It's just. It helps society. Also, they said this understanding of privilege warps the understanding of justice. So they said factors that give privilege in one setting will confer disadvantage in another. So here's an example. If you're a progressive atheist and you're living in a deep red rural area, maybe Oklahoma someplace or Wyoming, it may put somebody at a social disadvantage relative to an evangelical Christian who lives there. But that reverses, doesn't it? If you live, for example, in Portland, let's say, and you're an evangelical Christian, you will probably be at a social disadvantage. Or maybe you're on a progressive college campus. So they said many times it's the evangelical Christian who's going to be at a social disadvantage. And they said there are specific situations where racial or ethnic minorities experience privilege. They actually have things better. They said, for example, when they wrote the book, the U.S. Supreme Court was reviewing a case in which two prominent universities are accused of discrimination. Why? They admitted black and Hispanic applicants that had actually lower standardized test scores and grade point averages. They let more of them in than Asian counterparts who had higher test scores and higher grade point averages. Well, progressives are going to say, well, that's justified by America's history of racism. But they said it's odd, though, that the blacks and Hispanics are getting an unearned advantage in this situation, right? So it says at this point, it shows that Black and Hispanic identification confers an advantage. And if you're Asian, that's a disadvantage, which would mean what? Well, this flips all of critical theory on its head. It means that Blacks and Hispanics are privileged and Asians are marginalized. Right? Even if you think these practices are justified, they're flipping it on its head. So they said it's false to speak of privilege as if it's only in certain groups, if it operates a universal property that secures advantage in all situations. So sometimes you get an inversion of this. In fact, the white, the male, the heterosexual actually may be lesser in certain situations. In fact, I would say that's probably what's been going on with this rise of people who like Trump, because he seems to echo that it's the whites who have been oppressed. And so it's really weird to watch it. This is kind of turning upside down. Okay, the idea of privilege, they said also, ignores the advantage conferred by wealth and class, right? It's the idea that privilege refers to an absolute scale. So it said, if you turn again to the subject of white privilege, some people on the political right say it's nonsense to think that poor, uneducated white people possess white privilege. I mean, they're poor in Appalachia. What was that book by J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy? I mean, these people had it pretty bad. So contemporary critical theorists are not claiming that poor Appalachian people are privileged in an absolute sense, but that a poor, uneducated Appalachian person is privileged relative to a poor, uneducated Appalachian black person in the same situation. But they said that's not always the case. They said it's not reasonable to claim that Oprah Winfrey is oppressed with respect to her race and gender. I mean, she's got a net worth in billions. She doesn't experience anything remotely like genuine oppression. Said if you claim that she does, they said, wow, that's a strange redefinition of the word oppression. They said, actually, if you control for certain socioeconomic factors, a group of 30-year-old whites, 30-year-old blacks, and 30-year-old Mexican Americans in the U.S. are pretty close in rights and opportunities and agency and mobility. So it says these groups are really close compared to the separation they had in the 20s and in the 1800s. So they said the point is that this intersectional dogma is a fantasy about the power and privilege of certain groups. The reality is different than what long dead people experienced a long time ago. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And then they quote a black Baptist pastor. He says, the continuing assumption of universal marginalization across every era of African American history actually flattens the African American experience and contributes to the increasing irrelevance of black preaching. What do I mean? The experience of African Americans in 1830 could fairly be characterized as near universal enslavement, oppression, and marginalization. Few would deny it. But how should we describe African Americans in 1930? Should we consider life in the New Negro or Harlem Renaissance North equivalent to the sharecropping experience of the South? Moreover, the 1930s seem like a lifetime ago for African Americans born around 1980. The experience of 1980s generation African Americans is so different from preceding generations that a burgeoning number of books dare to argue for a post-black self-understanding. So they said what he's saying is basically any idea that there's this monolithic single understanding of black experience has crumbled a long time ago under the progress that African Americans have made and hard-earned victories. Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, I told you this is a long chapter, so again, there's much more to it, and so I think I'm going to stop at this point. And I'm not doing it justice. I know I'm not, because I'm having to skip through parts of it here, and I hope it didn't confuse anybody. But this is just such an excellent book. Doug Groothuis also has a good one, and I don't have the title of it with me, but if you look him up, he also discusses critical theory. It's far shorter and frankly a little easier to get through than this book, but this book has all sorts of notes where they got their information. It's trustworthy, and like I said, you can hear from what I covered that it's sincere, it's studious, it's thoughtful, it's not a rant or a rave. So I would really highly encourage you taking a look at that. Okay, well, I thank you for being part of this podcast. Hope you're having a good day, and let's do another podcast soon.